All right, welcome to Maximus Live episode 78. Can't believe we've done so many of these shows. I'm your host, Dr. Cam, CEO of Maximus, licensed clinical psychologist and psychiatry professor. And we like to take this hour to answer any and all questions regarding health and hormone optimization, whether it relates to the work that we're doing at Maximus or just health behaviors in terms of diet, exercise, sleep, focus, and relationships in order for you to be your healthiest and happiest. So we it looks like we have a gentleman in our waiting room who's I'm going to bring up for some live health coaching. Looks like Ben has some questions around enclomiphene. You can either type them in or try to go live on Instagram as well. Happy to chat with you there. And all right, well, why don't we get started? Every week, we like to start out with a weekly unpopular opinion. And this week's unpopular opinion is that if you are a health optimizer, you should not actually over optimize your health. And if you're not a health optimizer, you actually should. So this is the strange paradox of you can ask any doctor who sees patients. The paradox of health optimization is that the people who need it most are the least interested in doing it, and the people who are most interested in doing it need it the least. And that's sort of the unfortunate reality. Interestingly, from a personality perspective, there's two personality traits that basically predict whether you're going to be a health optimizer. So the first is a little bit, but not too much, of neuroticism, specifically anxiety. If you're kind of an anxious person and you're concerned about your health, you're more likely to be interested in health because, well, you want to avoid aging, diseases of aging and dying. And so it's honestly a lot of times anxiety driven, and it's usually a moderate amount of anxiety is the thing that pushes people the most. The people who have no anxiety are too chill to care about their health, and the people who are completely 100% anxious care about their health, but they can't really do anything about it because they're overwhelmed by negative emotion. They typically end up being very avoidant. So moderate degree of anxiety and then a high degree of conscientiousness. So it tends to be that people who are highly conscientious are the people who end up becoming health optimizers because they have the ability to be organized, disciplined, and actually implement some of these routines. The benefit of obviously doing so is when you actually do the damn thing, you feel better, and so you're more likely to engage in it because you're like, hey, ever since I started working out, I feel tremendously better. My mood and anxiety sort of improve over time. So now the irony of the whole thing, though, is people who are super conscientious and they're already doing a lot of health behaviors are the type of people who are most likely to be orthorexic, is the term that we use. It kind of has a parallel sound to anorexic. So people who are orthorexic are almost like obsessive compulsive about their health. And you see this all the time in that they're highly engaged people, and it's great, obviously, to care about your health, but they tend to kind of overdo it. And I typically, and it's weird for me because I like, if you're a doctor who's used to working in community settings, I used to work in hospitals and VAs, it's like pulling teeth to try to get people to do just like basic self-care. We're talking like brushing your teeth every goddamn day. So it's funny to kind of work with what we call a worried well population of folks who are health optimizers because they're almost like overdoing it. Like I had a conversation with someone recently who was doing really well, feeling great, their numbers were great, and they're like, well, can I be even better? And I'm like, listen, I'm all about health and performance optimization in terms of being your best. But unless you're like a professional athlete where there's a clear incentive for you to be moving from 95th percentile to 99th percentile, because that last half second is going to be the difference between being the best and not winning. It doesn't apply for most people. I think if you're already doing pretty well, ironically, I always tell people you gotta don't fix what isn't broken, because certainly, like for instance, increasing the dose of a medication, you're already feeling good, you're dialed in, you're getting good numbers, good feeling, subjective feeling. Sure, you can always experiment with it and go back down if it doesn't work for you, but I really believe in the concept of minimal effective dosage. You don't want to take more than you need because you always increase the side effects if you do. But I think psychologically that comes from that place of being an over optimizer. And so it's kind of funny with that small percentage of people who are health optimizers, I almost have to pull them back a lot of times and say, don't overdo it, don't over optimize, don't go nuts, essentially. I share this in our community. I really like Bill Clinton's acronym, which is KISS, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. That's a great little adage, not only for politics, but when it comes to health too. In that, look, 20% of the things that you do, according to the Pareto principle, result in 80% of the benefits. So, like the running joke on social media is these particularly entrepreneurs that are obsessed with their morning routine are definitely going overboard with the health optimization. Like if it's taking you more than an hour to do your health routine, it's too much. Just keep it really, really simple. The basic only things that I tell people to do in the morning is like get 10 minutes of sunshine, and a brief walk outside, get some protein to break your fast breakfast, and stay away from your phone for the first hour. Basically, other than that, I think that covers 80% of your bases. Yes, there's more stuff you can do, and take your medications and supplements. But other than that, with your breakfast, everything else is just going to be diminishing marginal benefit. So I got to pull those people back. Unfortunately, especially if you try to talk to your parents oftentimes about your health, or other family members, you'll see if they're not sort of on that anxious/conscientious spectrum, they're not health optimizers. They're often overweight, they're at risk for metabolic syndrome, diabetes, etc. And you're just trying to get them to not eat so much, processed carbs and sugar and bread and things like that. Forget trying to do some sauna ice bath morning routine. And so it's a weird thing of like, the people who need it the most don't do it, and the people who don't need it, who need it the least, overdo it. So I think this is where self-knowledge and analysis really comes in that you have to have psychological insight into where you are on the spectrum. We're all somewhere on the spectrum. If you're probably listening to this radio show, you're probably on the upper end of the spectrum in that you're a health optimizer. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's a good thing in that those people are healthier, for sure. I would definitely rather deal with a health optimizer, and I got to pull them back, than try to deal with someone who is doing nothing for themselves and is pretty sick and trying to motivate someone who, cannot even jog to basically do some basic walking. So let's count our blessings for sure. But I always tell, I think perfect is the enemy of good. We don't want to overdo and over-optimize those things. So if you know yourself, understand where you are on the spectrum, do an honest self-assessment of yourself, and try to really identify the things that give you the most bang for your buck. Because there really is dangers of over-optimizing. I'll give you another example. I was talking to someone on the forums who was, I think, trying to improve or tweak their fiber intake, and they were taking all kinds of not only natural sources of fiber, but fiber supplements, prebiotics, probiotics, and I think they were trying to solve some GI issue or disturbance, but they were actually getting constipated because maybe they were cutting down on their water intake, increasing their fiber intake. And I was telling them, I was like, you're actually probably making this worse. I know you're trying to solve a problem, but in your efforts to do so, you're doing too much at the same time. And so you don't understand what variable that you're isolating, that what is even potentially helping you. And because of all the things that you're overdoing, you actually may be introducing new problems in that, you're introducing all this fiber, you're reducing your water intake, and it should be causing constipation. I was like, it's not surprising that you're developing that symptom or that side effect from it. So simplify your routine, take care of yourself, and just tweak one thing at a time, keep it really basic. I told them, I was like, look, fiber is important, but just get it from natural fruits for the most part, maybe a little bit of vegetables as well, and see how that goes rather than spiking Metamucil and then doing some intermittent water fasting, which is overcomplicating your routine. So that's a great example of over-optimization. Keep it simple, stupid. And I say that not pejoratively, but just affectionately. And then you can go from there. I always think it's important to build a foundation or a base, and then you can start tweaking things, experimenting things. But I self-experiment. I definitely consider myself a health optimizer as well. But the difference is I will treat stuff as an experiment. I'll try it. If it's not working, I'll get rid of it. There's lots of supplements that I try. And most of them, honestly, they do not stay in my routine because, I try it, see if I get benefit. Is it worth the cost benefit, the money, etc.? And maybe you learn some things. Maybe it's useful as needed. A lot of the supplements that I have, I only really use on special occasions for particular things. They're not really part of a daily stack or a daily routine. So I'm, in fact, most of the time really trying to test stuff in order to simplify, right? How can I consolidate, take less things? In fact, it's probably only less than a handful of supplements I even take at this point, much of which has really been benefited from the Maximus Building Blocks Supplement that's kind of combined a lot of these into, one supplement. But otherwise, I just think for the sake of simplicity and sanity, it's also just nice to keep things simple and easy. So try to balance the perfectionism of optimization with a healthy, reasonable lifestyle so that A, you don't overdo it and hurt yourself, but also, yeah, don't be annoying to other people too. You're probably going to drive your wife or significant other crazy if, you're a little too overly conscientious about some of these things. So that's my weekly unpopular opinion. Hopefully we can get some folks in and ask some questions. Unfortunately, it looks like the two people that we had on the Zoom have dipped. So hopefully they will come back and I can ask, we can chat with them. In the meantime, I'll take some questions from the audience. All right. So Ben asks, how does enclomiphene work in the body, and does it work for everyone who takes it? All right, so good question. So enclomiphene is the main pharmaceutical agent that we use in the Maximus King Protocol. It is derived from an FDA-approved drug called Clomid, or clomiphene citrate. It's FDA approved for the treatment of fertility in women, and it's used off-label in men for the treatment of also fertility, but also for the treatment of secondary hypogonadism, or what's called low testosterone. It works by being a selective estrogen receptor modulator, of what's called a SERM. Essentially, it's a fancy term for being an estrogen blocker. And so by blocking estrogen or estradiol from binding to the estrogen receptors, it essentially tricks the body into thinking it's not getting enough estrogen. And so how the body responds to that is that the hypothalamus, which is a part of your brain, releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, stimulates the pituitary, another part of your brain, to release LH, luteinizing hormone, and follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, which reaches the testes, or your testicles, and that produces more of its own natural testosterone. That's why it actually stimulates the testes, it actually increases testicular volumes, or basically makes your balls bigger, and it actually increases fertility because the FSH increases sperm count and the LH increases testosterone. That's basically the mechanism of action. What you'll see in your lab results from, because we do before and after lab testing of taking enclomiphene, is that you'll see testosterone go up, typically about 1.5 to 2.5x, depending on the dosage that you take, from 6.25 milligrams. Actually, we have 3.125 milligrams all the way up to 25 milligrams. Most people are on 6.25 or 12.5 milligrams. That depends on their needs and their body weight. People who are lower in terms of their testosterone to begin with may need more medication. Obviously, if you're heavier, you may need more medication. But if you're a young, healthy guy, you often don't need very much. We find, in fact, a lot of guys on only 6.25 milligrams are quite responsive. They can double their testosterone levels using half the dose that was recommended in the clinical trials, because your body is kind of primed to produce testosterone with the right stimulation that the enclomiphene provides. So that's basically how it works. Does it work for everyone who takes it? That is a good question. No medication works for everyone who takes it. There's weirdly paradoxical results sometimes, even with medication. You can take painkillers, and sometimes in a small percentage of people, it causes more pain. So we absolutely cannot say it works for everyone. Now, for the overwhelming majority of people who are otherwise healthy, meaning your testicles still work, you don't have a testicular injury or some issue like primary hypogonadism, which means essentially your testicles are not responsive to the signaling of the LH and FSH, it will work. So I would say probably for 80+% of people, it does work, especially if they're healthy. So now it'll work to varying degrees. Some people will have a lesser response, maybe around the 1.5x. Some people have a phenomenal response. In fact, if you go on our Discord community, we have someone who on a higher dosage, even though he was starting out very low, had a 4.5x increase in terms of his free testosterone, and I believe a 3.75x increase in his total testosterone. Now, part of that is because of the higher dosage, but phenomenally high response took him from a very sub-physiological, like below first percentile level to a pretty normal average level. So it wasn't taking him into like bodybuilder range, but taking him from very low to normal, with a phenomenal result. And it also, I think, helped him put on 4 pounds of lean mass, which is one of the benefits that he was looking for. Good energy, good mood, all the other things that come along with it. So the nice thing, though, is because there's no dependency with enclomiphene, unlike TRT, you can always try it and see if it works for you. And if you take it along with our building block supplement and give it at least 90 days, because the doctor may need to adjust or titrate your medication, basically we offer a money back guarantee. If it doesn't increase your testosterone, we'll refund your money. So if you're truly primary hypogonadal and this is not the protocol for you, we'll refund the subscription portion of the protocol. So hopefully that's a useful answer to your question.
We have some questions via YouTube. First one that came in is, how about creatine, specifically Creatine HMB?
Was there a specific question that they had around creatine, or do I just generally like it or recommend it?
Yeah, more general.
Creatine is the most researched ergogenic supplement. Basically, it's on the market. There's decades of research. It helps support ATP production, which is a cellular source of energy. And it basically allows you functionally to do more reps when you're lifting weights at the gym. It's not really good for endurance training. It's better for sprint power training, so especially strength training. It will help you put on more lean muscle mass, may even help you cut a little bit of fat mass. Interestingly, it has some cognitive benefits as well in terms of if you're sleep deprived. It may be beneficial there. And so highly recommended. Now, all you need to take is creatine monohydrate. Creatine, all the other forms of creatine, including, I think, I'm not familiar with the creatine HMB form that you mentioned. There's no strong scientific evidence that the other forms of creatine, despite what supplement companies say, are any more effective. They're cost a lot more, and they probably provide no additional benefit. So I would stick to the tried and true creatine monohydrate. It's been well studied for decades. Just make sure that you get the Crea-pure type. It's not a brand, it's a type. It's basically manufactured in Germany. So it's very pure, has high quality control. You're not getting cheap creatine from China. And so make sure it's Crea-pure creatine that you're buying. It's worth a couple extra bucks to make sure that it is. But otherwise, creatine is actually rather cheap. You want to take about 2 or 3 to 5 grams a day. You don't need to do the loading phase, despite what people say. Just take it consistently. You can take it basically on workout days, or you can take it daily, whichever way you sort of prefer. So creatine is a useful supplement, and certainly I think it's synergistic with the King Protocol. All right, someone asked, any issues with Maximus King Protocol for someone who has high liver enzyme and low LDL, highish LDL? No, there's no adverse effects of enclomiphene on liver enzymes. There's no elevations in AST or ALT. Shouldn't exacerbate any pre-existing liver issues. Now, if you have a concern, talk to your existing healthcare provider if they have any concerns. Especially if you're under treatment for it. But intrinsically, it's not contraindicated. But talk to your provider. And people who have low LDL, highish LDL, there's no significant effect on lipids, to my knowledge, from the research literature. Now, you asked about, is there any issues with the protocol? So I was talking about it from the medication standpoint, but certainly the protocol involves lifestyle change, right? Diet, exercise, sleep, etc. Those things we can definitely help in terms of increasing your HDL and lowering your LDL, which is probably going to be primarily based on nutrition changes. So switching to a lower carbohydrate, less processed, less refined carbohydrate diet should decrease your LDL, especially the low particle size LDL, which is more important than total LDL. Eating high quality foods like eggs, shrimp, things that have high natural cholesterol will increase HDL, and engaging in sufficient exercise can also improve that as well. And also lower carbohydrate diets generally improve triglycerides and HDL to triglyceride ratio, which is probably a better marker of cardiovascular health than LDL is anyway. So no, there's no contraindications for people who have some hyperlipidemia. And in fact, I would argue if you take part in the health coaching aspect of it and are willing to change your diet, we can probably, in fact, improve your HDL and LDL numbers. Don't guarantee it, but it's obviously a function of how much work are you willing to do and how much change are you willing to make. But certainly from the experience that I have with my first company, Omada Health, dietary changes move those markers quite a bit in terms of reducing your risk for diabetes, heart disease, and cardiovascular, heart and cardiovascular disease. So it should actually be beneficial, I would argue, for those things. All right, my friend takes enclomiphene. His levels were at 345. Now it's at 978 in 3 months. Yeah, fantastic result. Just goes to show, it sounds like, your friend is almost tripling his testosterone levels. That's total testosterone. We care a little bit more about free testosterone. But generally, we find with SHBG, it doesn't change, or it'll slightly increase, but the increase in free testosterone is still far more than the increase that you see with any changes in SHBG that typically happens. As we've talked about in previous shows, SHBG is largely genetic, so you can't modify it too much. If it changes slightly in response to taking medication, it's not too much of a concern. What is the building blocks? This is the next question. What is the building block supplement used with enclomiphene? You discontinued the 80K. Why? I sent a whole email about this to all of our subscribers last week. 80K Evail is an off-the-shelf supplement, it's a really great supplement. It's actually the best off-the-shelf supplement that we found. It's produced by a company called Designs for Health, which is a very high-quality supplement manufacturer. However, it wasn't customized or personalized for our purposes. It comes in a 60 capsule glass bottle, but it has 5,000 IUs of vitamin D3 per capsule. We actually recommend 10,000 IUs. So the instructions on the label say take one. We would tell everyone to take two, and it would cause confusion. So we're like, look, we need to have our own custom supplement where we can provide clear instructions. We're not giving people conflicting information. So that's why we discontinued 80K Evail. It was a good temporary measure, but it wasn't sort of the right move long term. And so we came up with our own kind of dream supplement, which is like if we could have essentially the best multivitamin on the market that didn't have, cost constraints, where a lot of, unfortunately, multivitamins are made very cheaply. They literally use the cheapest forms of B vitamins that are not methylated, they're not bioavailable, et cetera. We're like, look, we're not going to spare any cost intrinsically and use the best bioavailable patented sources. Like an example of this is we use magnesium acetyltaurate, which is the best magnesium on the market. It's way more expensive than any other form of magnesium, but it has the best ability to cross the blood-brain barrier and have sort of that stress relieving, anxiety relieving effect, and also just help with mood, sleep, etc. So that was kind of the impetus behind the building block supplement. It is excuse me, more expensive to make, so we are charging, it's going to be $49.99 for it, which if you compare to other elite multivitamins is actually a pretty good deal. If you look at Thorne's multi-elite, which is, I would argue, the second best supplement on the market, multivitamin on the market, it's $69 a month. So ours is $49, and I would argue it's just as good. It doesn't have as much stuff. I think they throw in a bunch of unnecessary plant extracts in theirs. Ours is pretty focused on 15, basically. It's an essential multivitamin. It's like all the stuff that is really essential, and there's some special stuff that's really for hormone optimization. So the geranol, the forms of vitamin K2, the tocotrienols, the special form of vitamin E, are really in dosages and forms that are optimal for hormone function. So you won't see that in other multivitamins at all. And then obviously the dose of vitamin D that we use is really critical to get people from suboptimal to optimal dosages. So
We had a question via YouTube. What is the upper limit of LH?
It's a great question. So LH, luteinizing hormone, as we talked about, is what's released by the pituitary to stimulate testosterone from the testes. There's a normal range, or what's called a reference range, for LH. And so depends on the lab that's being used. So like, and this also differs for obviously men and women, but in this context, we're talking about men. So for 18 to 59-year-old male, the reference range is between 1.5 to like 9.3. Now, if you're talking about a 60-plus-year-old male, it's 1.6 to 15.2. Interestingly, the reference range is much higher for older adults. So that reference range is basically defined as if you take a sample of folks within those age brackets, it's between the 2.5 to 97.5 percentile, meaning this applies to 95% of men. It doesn't, so if you're below that, you're subphysiological. If you're above that, you're superphysiological. Now, is it problematic to be above the physiological range? On the King Protocol or enclomiphene, no, because that's the mechanism of action. That's what it's supposed to do, is it's supposed to increase LH. Now, I know some people have asked about theoretical concerns of, do you get LH receptor insensitivity or downregulation? There's no research to support that. And clinically, we know from guys, for instance, who are taking HCG, which is basically synthetic LH, and taking very large dosages of it for long term, it doesn't intrinsically seem to, cause any issues. Now, there's other issues with HCG, but having elevated endogenous or exogenous LH does not seem to be inherently problematic if it's slightly above the reference range. And like I said, with enclomiphene, it's quite normal that, in fact, people will be at the upper end, either slightly below or slightly above that top end of that reference range. So the most important thing is, look, are you feeling good? And is that high LH stimulating your testosterone production? If your LH is very high and you're not getting any testosterone increase, it probably suggests that you have primary hypogonadism, and this is not the right protocol for you because your testes basically don't work. And you probably need to be on TRT. That doesn't apply for most people. It's a smaller percentage of people. But most people see is high LH. They'll see an elevation in their LH on the protocol, which means that it's doing its job. And then if your testes are working, your testosterone will concomitantly go up as well. So we don't get sort of stressed out about elevations in LH or even elevations in estradiol on this protocol. We don't even bother measuring it anymore because it's basically uninterpretable while taking a SERM.
We had another question via YouTube. Is a lower SHBG always better?
I don't think it's better or worse. So the question is a lower SHBG better? A lot of people think that because when you have a lower SHBG, you have more free testosterone, right? Because it's not binding to the testosterone, so it's free to go about its business and bind to the androgen receptor. So a lot of people are like, oh, how do I lower my SHBG? How do I lower my SHBG? And we've talked about this. One, it's genetic, so it's not even worth messing with for the most part. Dr. Eugene Shippen, our advisor, kind of has a theory that you adapt and your body gets used to a certain level of SHBG. So even if you did pharmacologically reduce it, you actually might end up feeling a little wonky because you've walked around for a couple decades with an SHBG at a certain level, and you're kind of used to how that feels, if it makes sense. For that reason, it's not worth changing. But also, is a low SHBG better? No, I think what the body essentially adjusts your total testosterone to account for how much SHBG you have. So we always make this analogy of, imagine you have two identical twins. One has low SHBG, the other has high SHBG. The guy with high SHBG, the body just produces more total testosterone because it's almost like, if you think about SHBG, it's like a dam, right? It's preventing the flow, or it restricts the flow. Or another way you could say it is like a thicker wider or thinner pipe. And so you're just going to get, your body produces more volume in order to make up for it, versus the person with low SHBG, they don't need as much total testosterone because more trickles through, if that makes sense. In the end, the identical twins are going to have the same amount of free T, just that one person will have high total T, high SHBG. The other person is going to have medium total T, medium SHBG, but they'll end up with the same free T number. So it's not intrinsically better. And then second, low SHBG genetically is associated with higher risk of insulin resistance and diabetes. So that's the other thing I tell people is, higher risk of diabetes is not a great thing. Now, we don't know if altering it to be low will increase your risk of diabetes, but we know that people who are naturally born with low SHBG have a higher risk of diabetes. So it's not necessarily something I would, given that information, be striving for. Alrighty, good questions.
We have another question via YouTube. If we are trying to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep but naturally wake up at 6 to 7, do we try and go back to bed using the sleep alarm technique versus morning alarm technique?
So the goal is to get 8 to 9 hours of sleep. And so the question is, read that last part again.
But naturally, I wake up sleeping only 6 to 7 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Do we try to go back to bed?
Well, the question is, can you go back to bed? The challenge for a lot of people is they can't go back to bed for a couple reasons. One, your circadian rhythm gets used to waking up at a certain time. And ironically, the more consistent you are about waking up at that time, your body will, out of habit, just get used to waking up at that time, no matter how much you've slept. So this is kind of the worker's dilemma versus the student life. Students kind of wake up whenever they want, and they're also kind of younger and healthier and have less, typically, dysregulation of sleep. Although in this era with all this computer and video games, that may not be true anymore. But, because of the variability in their wake-up time, they can kind of sleep in as much as they need. When you're used to, let's say, waking up at 6 in the morning every single day, and then you get to Saturday and you want to sleep in on the weekend, your body's so used to waking up at 6, it probably will. So that's just kind of a habitual thing that happens. And so it becomes hard just out of habit to sleep in. Second, there's typically a cortisol spike that happens in the morning. And when you get that cortisol spike, and it's a useful thing, it wakes you up, literally gets you out of bed, gets you to go about your day, it's hard to go back to sleep because that's when your cortisol level or your stress hormone is essentially highest. So my point of view is, if you have the ability naturally to go back to sleep, let's say you wake up after 6 to 7 hours, but you're like, man, I'd really love to have an extra hour or two, and you can, and obviously it fits your lifestyle, you're not going to get in trouble with your family or work, then awesome, do so. If you can't, then you got to adjust a different way. Best way of adjusting is to slowly tweak your bedtime back so that if you're trying to get, let's say, 8 hours of sleep, you're still waking up at 6 in the morning, but now you got to go to bed by 10 o'clock in order to accommodate that. Now, some people find if they start moving their bedtime back, instead of getting the full 8 hours, they may still get 6 to 7 hours of sleep because now they're waking up at 4 or 5 in the morning. So that may tell you two things, is that one, maybe that is just the amount of sleep that your body needs or can get at this point in your life. So if it was 4 to 5 hours, I'd say, okay, there's something wrong. You probably have some insomnia or some underlying issue that's interfering with your sleep. But there's a lot of people where if they're not super physically active, 6 to 7 hours, I mean, ideally 7, but there's a lot of people where 6 to 7 hours is sort of enough-ish and normal, where they're able to function pretty well. And kind of my litmus test I always tell people is, let's say you're getting 6 hours of sleep. Yes, it's not in the optimal 7 to 9 hour range, but how do you feel during the day? Are your energy levels normal? Are you able to focus? And do you not need to rely on stimulants? Now, it's fine if you drink your coffee or tea, but I'm just saying if you didn't have it, would you like fall apart? If your energy is good, your focus is on point, and you don't need to use stimulants as a crutch versus an enhancer, then maybe you're honestly fine on six hours of sleep. So it's not intrinsically bad. It may be more optimal, however, to get a little bit more. But sometimes I find that the other way to increase sleep duration is that if you think about sleep as the recovery that's needed to accommodate your lifestyle or the physical demands of your body, it may be that you're not demanding enough of your body in order to get more rest or recovery. So one thing you can do is just look at how much physical activity that you're doing. A lot of the people who only get 6 hours, besides out of the habit, the habitual circadian rhythm thing that I talk about, is also because they're not super active. And so maybe their body just doesn't need as much rest. If you're walking at least 8,000, maybe even 10,000 steps plus per day, if you're doing heavy strength training or doing some high intensity interval training on a daily to every other day basis, it will increase your sleep demands. So the other thing that I recommend is just tire yourself out is actually a really, really effective technique for sleeping more. If you've ever experienced this, by the way, from traveling, a lot of people, they don't walk a lot at home because they're driving, commuting, etc. They have their sort of lifestyle set up. When you're traveling, you obviously don't have your car with you most of the time, and you just walk a lot, 15, 20,000 plus steps if you're traveling, especially in places like Europe where it's very walkable. And the amazing thing that happens when you go from 5,000 steps, most Americans, by the way, walk for like somewhere around 3,000-ish steps a day. It's remarkably low. And then all of a sudden you go to 10, 15, 20,000 steps a day. You become exhausted at the end of the day, and you sleep like a baby. So I think it's a combination of like a new environment, but also it's really the walking that does it for people. So one of the interventions that I do with a lot of my clients, if they're really having sort of some trickier insomnia issues besides all the sleep hygiene and CBTI stuff that you do as sort of standard treatment for insomnia, is to get them to walk more, and particularly try to walk before bed, as long as obviously your environment is safe to do so. It can be really, really helpful to almost like pre-exhaust yourself before bed. And a lot of people find, minimum 1,000, but a couple thousand steps in the evening shortly before bedtime can be really, really helpful to help people fall asleep. Now, obviously, you can do higher intensity exercise right before bed, but people have different responsiveness to that. Some people, they can just like lift heavy weights, and then as long as they do their shower, maybe eat a little bit, fall asleep like a baby, it's not a problem, doesn't interfere with them. Now, there is some research literature that if you elevate your body temperature too much, it prevents you from getting into deep sleep. But honestly, I would just listen and trust your body. If the only time that you have is to work out, and you're a night person, you like working out at night, you're doing it shortly before bed, and it works for you, and you're otherwise sleeping deeply, sleeping enough, screw what the research literature says. This is the part I was talking about at the beginning of the show in terms of don't over-optimize. Do what works for you. But some people, if you're doing high intensity exercise right before bed, it does overstimulate them and keep them up. So I would say listen to your body and see how you respond. And the type of exercise also matters a lot too. Obviously, a lot of people engage in sexual activity, and that is a form of exercise right before bed. And honestly, despite the fact that it's intense, or at least it should be intense if you're doing it right, it knocks people out because there's obviously some unique elements to sexual activity in terms of the increase in oxytocin and the increase in prolactin. Oxytocin lowers cortisol, it's the love or cuddle hormone. Prolactin is responsible for the refractory period for males, and it also tends to make them a little sleepy. That, and obviously the physical exercise alone for both men and women generally knocks them out. And so that's also my preferred form of cardio that I like to recommend to people. Obviously, if you have the partner and the availability to do so, really does help sleep quite a bit. Orgasm helps sleep a lot. And so if you have the opportunity to do that, it's a great form of exercise, and it helps quite a bit with sleep as well. So that's what I would say. Don't underestimate the impact of physical activity, whether formal exercise or extracurricular, if you will, in terms of regulating your insomnia and improving your sleep quite a bit. Last thing I'll say, if you're a 6 to 7 hour person and you're trying to get more sleep, but you can't sleep in, as we talked about, it may be okay to try napping during the day. So the ideal nap time, as we've talked about, is 7 hours after wake up time. So if you're waking up at, let's say, 7 in the morning, you want to shoot for about 2 p.m. in the afternoon, which historically, culturally, is right around the time for siesta in Spanish, Italian, etc. cultures. So generally that 2 to 3 o'clock-ish window is traditionally the time that people, sort of the early afternoon nap. I think in those cultures, traditionally, they'd sleep for about 60 to 90 minutes. I actually am a fan of shorter naps. 20 to 45 minutes is what I recommend, because A, it prevents you from getting into deep sleep. And if you get into deep sleep, it may impair your ability to fall asleep early that night. And so one of the problems that I see with sort of chronic nappers is that they almost fall into a negative cycle perpetually, in that they don't get enough sleep. Let's say they get 6 hours of sleep. They're tired. So they're like, well, I got to take a nap. And now they take a nap. They sleep for an hour or two. And now they're like, great, I got my 7 to 8 hours. But now you've slept so much and you got into deep sleep pretty, within the afternoon. That's only, maybe 8 hours away from your bedtime. And now you can't fall asleep early again. And then the cycle repeats over and over again. So you got to break out of the cycle. And that's temporarily the answer, obviously, is you got to suck up the sleep deprivation for a little bit, go to bed early so that you can get the 7 to 8 hours within the normal long stretch of night so that you don't have to take a nap. And so if you're going to take a nap, which the preferred way to do it is to take 20 to 45 minutes, prevents you from falling into deep sleep, prevents you from not being able to fall asleep early that night. And it's kind of that booster energy kind of nap. I tell my clients this all the time. It's better to treat naps as a supplement rather than making up for the sleep deprivation. If you're making up for sleep deprivation because you're only sleeping, let's say six hours a night, and you need the nap to get that extra 1 to 2 hours, it's okay temporarily, but you're kind of plugging a hole. The best thing to do is fix your nighttime sleep so that you don't have to take a nap. It's also inconvenient to take 1 to 2 hour nap during the middle of the day for most work schedules or people, even if you're dealing with your family. We're not sort of set up, unfortunately, in American society to do that very well. Maybe in the remote work from home era we can do that, but I don't know. I don't think it's a great idea to take 2 hours off in the middle of the day when someone needs you at work. So I don't think it's optimal. Better thing to do is try to get to your 7 to 9 hours. And if you're doing a lot of work or a lot of exercise and you're tired, do that 20 to 45 minute booster nap as needed. You can do it daily too. There's nothing wrong with that. But I really think it's better to treat naps as like a booster, a bonus, kind of a thing that you do as needed. It's really a true supplement in the proper use of the term, rather than something that you're relying on to make up for your sleep deprivation and you're perpetuating it. In some ways, I'll make the analogy here that naps are a lot like caffeine, in that when you're chronically sleep deprived, caffeine is a godsend because it helps you function. But in the long term, it also perpetuates the problem because it messes with your sleep and you become reliant on it. Same thing, you can become basically overly reliant on long naps to make up with your chronic sleep deprivation. So try to keep them shorter so that you're not overdoing it. It's just like 1 cup of coffee or tea is generally fine for most people if you're taking it in the morning and early afternoon. No detriments, probably won't mess with your sleep because it's out of your system within the 8 to 10 hours generally, depending on your metabolism after you take it. Same thing with naps. If it's short and it's not too close to your bedtime, it's probably fine. It won't mess with you. So this is really an example of the dose is the poison. Little amounts, totally fine. If you overdo it, that's when it becomes problematic and you develop too much of a dependency on it. All right. Someone chimed in and said, knocks me out every night. Well, I'm glad you're getting your cardio in. So any other questions? All right. I think unless anyone has any other questions, we may be good for today. I'm sorry we didn't get to the 1 or 2 people who joined at the beginning of the radio show. If you're listening, my recommendation is don't join right at 6 o'clock Pacific. Join at like 6:15 or hang on for 15 minutes while I blab about my unpopular opinion. So either be patient, or if you got things to do, I don't blame you. Just join us somewhere between 6:15 and 7, and I promise we'll get to it. we just like to do the weekly unpopular opinion because it kind of warms up the show. It adds a little, I don't know, spice and personality to the damn thing. So it's not just Q&A the whole time. So sorry if that kept you from joining, but 6:15 to 7 o'clock is the best possible time. One last question that seems like we got here is should multivitamins be taken earlier in the day? Good question. It depends on what's in the multivitamins, but if it's a typical multivitamin, they often have B vitamins in it, and also for some people vitamin D. Both of those can be energizing. And so it's great because it does boost your energy to take vitamin D and the B vitamins. But for some people who are very sensitive, it can negatively affect their sleep. So my preference is to take multivitamins in the morning because it reduces the likelihood that it's going to affect with your sleep. Like I said, people are different. Some people are fine. They can take a multivitamin right before bed. It doesn't do anything for them. But I always say better safe than sorry. If you take it in the morning, it's unlikely to mess with your sleep. Plus, you get to enjoy the energy benefits if you are more sensitive to it. If you take it right before bed and you knock out, well, you're missing out on some of the benefits, at least the acute benefits that you can feel. Hopefully, it'll carry you forward to the next day as well in terms of making sure that you don't have any nutritional deficiencies. So I am a fan of taking multivitamins in the morning. Just one thing to watch out for if you're not taking ours, a lot of multivitamins not only use cheap ingredients, but so spend the money, buy a good multivitamin. But two, males shouldn't generally be taking iron. It's easier to overload on iron, and iron and some of the other minerals can cause nausea in people and really like messes with your stomach. So be careful in the morning if you're taking it on an empty stomach because you're basically fasted. It can cause a little bit of upset stomach or nausea. If that's true for you, it's better to take your multivitamin with food, which is generally what I recommend anyway for other reasons, because if your multivitamin has fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, they're better absorbed with food. A moderate amount of fat is what the research shows enhances the absorption of vitamin D in particular. So both to prevent nausea and to enhance the bioavailability of the multivitamin, take it with breakfast. And if you're not eating breakfast, eat breakfast. I know you intermittent fasters out there apparently hate breakfast, but I'm a fan of breakfast. It doesn't need to be a 4-course meal, but get a little protein, even if it's a protein shake. And that's all you're doing for breakfast. That's breakfast. Anything that's protein is breakfast. So highly recommend taking it with a little bit of food. So thank you, Doc. Much appreciated. Yep, absolutely. Great question. By the way, I don't think multivitamins are absolutely necessary. I think if you actually look at the research literature, there's not strong evidence that they're, like for instance, make you live longer in terms of enhancing longevity. I think about it as an insurance policy in that, look, the best way to get your vitamins is from food. Whole food, always. I'll be the first to say that. So like vitamin D, you should really be getting from seafood in the sun, honestly. The problem is we don't spend enough time in the sun, even here in Southern California, so it's almost impossible for people to do so. In that case, it makes sense for people to supplement vitamin D. But the rest, in terms of the multivitamin, your zinc, your copper, blah, blah, blah. I mean, yeah, if you're eating oysters, eating fresh seafood, you'll get enough of those things. Again, a lot of people are not eating perfect diets. And so if you're not eating a really, really optimized ideal diet, then it may be useful to supplement as needed. Now, I always say try with the food. Like, for instance, I don't take a fish oil supplement. I try to eat fish. I have sardines, for instance, on every day. Typically, kippers, some type of highly fatty fish that naturally has omega-3s. Also because a lot of fish oil supplements are generally rancid, so I don't like most of them. But if there's a particular use case where you're like trying to get extra EPA or DHA, or same thing, you're not naturally going to get enough vitamin D from the sun, then it makes sense to supplement and take the multivitamin as almost like insurance to make up for the gaps or deficiencies that you have. What would happen if someone took the highest dose of enclomiphene? Well, the higher dosage, you're going to typically have a higher response in terms of higher LH, higher testosterone. And so that's what the research literature shows. So for instance, usually the 25 milligram dosage of enclomiphene, typically you get closer to about a 2.5x increase versus a 1.5x increase on the lower dose of, like, let's say 6.125 milligrams. Now, that I know that sounds very sexy because you're like, well, testosterone's good, more testosterone's better. Why would I not take the highest dose? Because we treat symptoms, not numbers. There's a lot of people, in fact, who inject testosterone and feel terrible. And if you don't believe me, even though people, sing the praises of testosterone replacement therapy, go on discussion forums of people who are on injectable testosterone replacement therapy. You'll mostly see a lot of complaints. There's a lot of people who are happy, but there's a lot of people who are constantly trying to dial in their dosage, and they're unhappy. And often the more they take, the more side effects they have. It also elevates your estradiol or estrogen when you're on really high doses of testosterone. And so it can really throw you off. And with enclomiphene, just like TRT, that's true as well. You're getting more and more estrogen receptor blockage. So it is possible for people to start actually having diminished libido on higher dosages, even though they typically have increased libido 75% of the time on lower dosages. So ironically, sometimes it can have paradoxical effects. So more is not always better. I keep always repeating that mantra. But for some people, they need it. We have, like the guy who I mentioned, who had a 4.5x increase. He needed the highest dose because he was super low to begin with, and I think kind of worked his way up from 12.5 to 25. For a lot of other folks, they're really good on the 6.25 and 12.5. They don't need the highest dose, and in fact, they shouldn't be on the highest dose because they're going to feel worse, ironically. Don't always presume that higher testosterone means feeling your best. Feeling your best is kind of a sweet spot, and I really do think it's kind of like a Goldilocks thing. It's not too high, it's not too low. It's usually on the higher end of normal. I kind of describe it as like, well, we base our internal sort of reference ranges on healthy young 19 to 39-year-old non-obese men. Essentially, it's like a young healthy man. And if you think about like the average fit guy in your 20s, that's what you should be sort of striving for, not above and beyond that. So that's typically what would happen on a higher dose of enclomiphene, but I always tell people that more is not always better. You want to find, again, the minimal effective dose that gets you the most bang for your buck in terms of how you feel. So pay attention to subjective feelings as well. That's why we do the symptom questionnaires. In addition to the lab tests, I actually think they're more important because, your mood, your energy, your libido, your drive, your confidence, your erectile quality, your work performance, and your athletic performance are ultimately what matters, right? You're taking it not to have a sexy looking number on a lab sheet and be like, hey bro, look how high my testosterone is. Who cares, right? Other than for the bragging rights. We do the lab testing to A, show that it works, B, so that we can adjust the dosage properly, but C, in the end, really, how you feel and how you function is really what matters. So, good question. Good to go? All right, I think that is it for today. So thank you, everyone. Really great questions. I really appreciate everyone that typed in on Instagram Live and YouTube. Really appreciate. I got my loyal fan base on both of those platforms. Hopefully next week we'll get some live folks. I know we had them last week, and unfortunately I think it was just a timing issue this week, but we'll be back. So catch me next Thursday, 6 o'clock, and be ready for your questions there. In the meantime, feel free to continue the conversation on our community. It's discord.maximistribe.com. It's actually been pretty poppin', as I like to say. Pretty active in terms of the discussion. Really good discussion from pharmacology, supplementation, health behavior change. You got actually a pretty active professional finance forum, interestingly as well. I know we don't talk too much about financial health, but I actually do think that's really important. And we definitely got some professional stock traders and gurus, hedge fund managers, traders, etc., who can give you some really good advice there. So I'll see you on the discussion forums, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.